Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility, with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
There's a lot we need to learn about the economics of delivery, but just starting off, the stuff that does have some very solid numbers behind it, like, for example, medical drones for organs and whatever else, that's really interesting. And you've already had people look at the market and say, hey, that's really fragmented. Let's go after it using new technology. That's going to be really interesting. Next, of course, we're going to have to learn what it actually costs for routine delivery of, shall we say, less exotic cargo, less exotic payloads. Will it ever really be competitive with terrestrial transport? We don't know that yet, but it's possible, especially in certain areas, certain different distances, and with certain assumptions about labor costs. There are a lot of variables there.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Vertical Space. Today we speak with Richard Aboulafia, Managing Director at AeroDynamic Advisory, a boutique aerospace and defense management consultancy. We all know Richard because of his insightful commentary in major publications, on TV, and from his terrific monthly newsletter. There are few who are more listened to in our industry than Richard. We start with a discussion of the macro trends and drivers influencing the commercial and defense aviation markets. Then we engage in a terrific discussion on the future of aviation and how geopolitics and technology will shape aviation in the coming years. So, of course, we talked about advanced air mobility and what areas Richard is excited about, as well as his concerns and why. Really important to zero in on this conversation, as Richard shares valuable insights that our audience will want to listen to closely and take advantage of what he considers both the strengths and the weaknesses of the market. Very cool are Richard's comments on the barriers to entry, as well as the barriers to exit in aviation. Not something you hear about every day. Lastly, a great discussion around sustainability, including a detailed discussion around sustainable aviation fuel. When you have a person of Richard's capability, experience, and reputation, it's always fun to hear responses to, for example, who he most respects in the industry, what advice he would give to our audience of entrepreneurs, and how he sees the next 10 plus years playing out in both commercial and in military aviation. So it's another great podcast. Richard, listen, thanks so much for joining us. And to our audience, enjoy Richard's conversation as you innovate in the vertical space.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by Avionics. Avionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let Avionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. Avionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Since 1988, Richard Aboulafia has tracked aircraft programs, markets, and companies as an analyst and consultant. He manages consulting projects in the commercial and military aviation field and analyzes broader defense and aerospace market and industry trends. He has advised numerous aerospace companies, including most prime and most second and third tier contractors in the US, Europe, and Asia. He also advises numerous financial institutions on aerospace market conditions. Richard is a managing director at AeroDynamic Advisory, a boutique aerospace and defense management consultancy headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Prior to joining AeroDynamic in January of 2022, he was vice president of analysis at Teal Group. There, in addition to his consulting role, he wrote and edited Teal Group's World Military and Civil Aircraft Briefing, a forecasting and analysis tool covering over 135 aircraft programs and markets. He is a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. He also writes publicly about aviation and defense, with regular columns in Aviation Week and Space Technology and at Forbes.com. His articles have also appeared in Foreign Policy, Royal Aeronautical Society Aerospace Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, Slate, AIAA's Aerospace America, The Financial Times, Professional Pilot, and other publications. Frequently cited as an aviation industry authority by trade and news publications, Richard has appeared on numerous television news and radio programs, including ABC, BBC, Bloomberg, Reuters, CBS, CNN, NBC, NPR, and PBS. He has also spoken at numerous conferences, including Speed News, ATRIF, NAFA, IADA, Aero Montreal, the Ontario Aerospace Council, and PNAA. Since 2012, he has served on the National Aeronautic Association Collier Trophy Selection Committee. He has testified before Congress. He also presents a yearly lecture at the National Defense University Industrial College of the Armed Forces and has served as an expert witness in aerospace markets. Before he joined Teal Group in 1990, Richard analyzed the jet engine market at Jane's Information Group, served as an aerospace industry consultant for an international trade advisory company, and supported research projects at the Brookings Institution. He has a master's degree in war studies from King's College, University of London, and a bachelor's degree from George Washington University. He lives in Washington, D.C. Richard Aboulafia, welcome to the podcast. Please meet Luka Tomjanovich and Peter Shannon.
It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
A question that we usually start with because we want to get some controversy out in the beginning, but Richard, I don't think there's going to be any issue with you here. So is there anything that very few in the aerospace, aviation, or advanced air mobility space agree with you on?
You know, it's a very segmented and siloed industry. So what people might not agree with me in one segment, outside of that segment, they might agree with me. It's, but I consider myself in a lot of ways pretty, I guess, bearish on a couple of topics that have become extremely popular in the industry. For example, speed. I just don't see the argument for increased speed in several key segments, particularly commercial jetliners. Another thing that I'm pretty bearish on, EV tolls. I don't think it's a waste of time. I think there's exciting new technologies coming down the pike, but I think the addressable market is somewhat overstated, especially relative to the number of new players and the amount of cash they're putting into it. So I think those are probably my big areas of divergence with a lot of the industry at this point. But on the other hand, I think back to the days of the very light jet and air taxi and the A380 and the C series and other things that I felt really kind of alone on. This time around, I think there's kind of a broader level of skepticism in many different areas. I think people are taking more of a critical approach to the industry.
What about the drone component of advanced air mobility? What do you think of the use case? What do you think of the market overall?
I think it's pretty interesting. There's a lot we need to learn about the economics of delivery, but just starting off, the stuff that does have some very solid numbers behind it, like, for example, medical, drones for organs and whatever else, that's really interesting. And you've already had people look at the market and say, hey, that's really fragmented. Let's go after it using new technology. That's going to be really interesting. Next, of course, we're going to have to learn what it actually costs for routine delivery of, shall we say, less exotic cargo, less exotic payloads. Will it ever really be competitive with terrestrial transport? We don't know that yet, but it's possible, especially in certain areas, certain different distances, and with certain assumptions about labor costs. There are a lot of variables there.
Well, we certainly have started to see hints of those in the market with some of the pioneering companies doing delivery of small packages. So that's a promising area, at least as we're concerned, and happy to chat a bit more about that later in the podcast. But how about we stay on the big picture now, zoom out a little bit, and tell us about the most important macro drivers that you see shaping aviation, whether this is commercial or military.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Luke. And I think there's a couple of big drivers right now, and I'll unfortunately, neither are particularly great for the commercial segment, but for the broader industry, that's another story. One is the very significant and probably long-term increase in defense spending worldwide. We just hit over $2 trillion a year. We hadn't hit that pretty much ever, I believe. And it's a fairly broad-based increase. The US had already hit record highs a couple of years ago, and now we're seeing the same fast growth in Europe and Asia. Now, from the broader industry standpoint, that's certainly good news, and most suppliers have fairly good exposure to both civil and military markets. But it also has a way of crowding out investment cash for the commercial side of things. So that's a macro trend that bears watching. We last saw some of this back in the Vietnam War, but nothing like as strong as it is now. Another trend, of course, is the whole issue of environmental concerns, particularly by young people, particularly in Europe. And we don't know how this is going to manifest itself, but it really bears watching. especially, of course, if it takes the form of punitive tariffs or limits on use, business aircraft, anything like that. We've been the most aggressively self-policing industry, I would argue, on the planet. I mean, every year for the past 70 years, we've gotten 1 or 2% better at fuel burn and emissions and whatever else. We need to keep that going, and we need to keep it going at a time where the obvious routes of improvement, particularly turbine engine technology, might be reaching the end of its runway. So I think this is the other big macro trend, how to keep that efficiency and ecological improvement that we've seen in the industry for 70 years going at the current pace.
As you think about the technologies and perhaps changes in the way that we as an industry conduct operations in order to keep this efficiency gain going, and as we start introducing these new approaches, how do you think that translates into some of the perhaps unknown drivers today that might start to play a critical role for the industry in the years to come?
Yeah, and the operative word there is unknown, right? I mean, it was pretty clear over the last 70 years, there were some interesting things you could do with, say, materials or airframe shapes, but most of it came down to turbine engines. Okay, well, that's kind of, unless we're going to make a radical break and do prop fins or just more propellers or whatever, then a lot more has to be done with, I don't know, sustainable aviation fuel, hybrid electric, hydrogen, and take your pick. And you ask 5 people, you get 6 opinions on the relative potential of some of these technologies. So people are being asked to put their R&D cash into so many different buckets with such uncertainty. And that, I think, is sort of making a, shall we say, an uncertain landscape, particularly for AAM, but everything else. We don't know who's going to work. The good old days of saying, Pratt & Whitney, GE, and Rolls-Royce, they'll come through for us. And that's pretty much the end. Everything else will just be on the margins. Nope. We're going to need some big breakthroughs, and we don't know who are going to produce them.
How do you deal with this uncertainty? When you're evaluating the impact of new technologies, what's your thought process? Do you start with historical precedents and previous attempts at introducing new technology, or do you go for the market demand signals? Do you look for potential of this new technology to open up perhaps new markets, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I put it into 3 different headings. One is absolutely looking at historical, I traffic in metaphors, right? So I really like looking at history for parallels that might be instructive. The second is to just talk to as many people as possible, pure and simple. And that's the interesting thing. There are so many people who are not in our industry, but can contribute to our understanding of the future roadmap. Chemical engineers, for instance, and physicists. Very often they're very happy to talk to you or to the people I work with and getting their perspective on what's likely to happen. We could be going down a path of hydrogen, then you talk to people in that discipline who say, are you kidding? How are you going to have all that equipment for negative 250 degrees storage on your plane? That doesn't make any sense. So getting that perspective is important. Then finally, user interviews, whether it's the people who design next generation aircraft or the people who buy them, talk to them, get a feel for what they're saying. And, unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer airlines with actual honest to God engineering departments, but there are still a few left. And they're wonderful to talk to because they're the ones who are going to be actually out there burning the kerosene, the batteries or the hydrogen or whatever we come up with. So that's a good way to go down.
Right. Those are all very important points. And I think one thing that I would, as I'm hearing you describe this thought process, I'm imagining you driving the car and looking at the rear view mirror and anticipating that what you see around the corner will be somewhat similar to what you're seeing in the rear view mirror. So I'm not discounting the need to look at lessons in the history, but I guess I'm trying to say there's a delicate balance between being a student of history and then having an open enough mind to imagine certain new ways of doing business with technology that did not exist in the past.
Yeah, that's right. And especially, when you look across the globe, one of the most interesting aspects when the Soviet Union fell and the wall came down, There was a lot of interesting stuff, very little of it successful, but there was an awful lot to look at. Prop fans, for example, or even hydrogen. They had their experiments with that. There's so much to look for in the past.
What do you think are some of the interesting trends that most industry insiders or investors are not paying enough attention to today?
Well, the macroeconomic drivers that have always impacted the business are changing, and so are the geopolitical ones. And it's no fault of ours, but we do tend to be a bit stovepipe, right? I mean, that's just the nature of humans. But you have to look out. I mean, how, for example, is China affecting things? Because once upon a time, it was everyone's favorite hot growth market. And now it's everybody's favorite military threat. How does that impact new product development? Because a lot of people were focused on the China market. And look at it from another standpoint, how does the emerging confrontation, I'm afraid that's the word, in the Western Pacific impact combat systems design? What does it mean for aerospace companies? What challenges do they have to rise to make the force structures needed to deal with these challenges? And also the macroeconomics. It's obvious that after 40 years, all of a sudden we have inflation and higher interest rates. This is an industry that's heavily interest rate sensitive. And we've had this wonderful environment for new product development where cash was basically free for the past 15 years. And all of a sudden that's changing. So I think some of the big picture stuff that we might pay attention to them in our personal lives, but we might not make the connection in how it impacts our industry. I think that's the important thing to pay attention to.
And I have to follow up. How do you think that the war that we're seeing in Ukraine, and you bring up China as well, how do you think that those two forces will shape the future of the industry?
As I mentioned before, part of it is just coping with an environment, a market environment that's much more heavily defense. And I really wonder whether some of the cash that would have gone into new commercial development instead goes into, I don't know, hypersonics or multispectral sensing or something that's got more military relevance and has a cost plus contract attached to it rather than any commercial risk that you'd find in the civil aviation sector. So that's a major concern. On the positive side, it's obvious that the kind of warfighting challenges needed to cope with the Pacific environment and the inherent problems of numbers and range are going to have an impact on aerospace systems development. I'm thinking in particular of artificial intelligence that'll be needed for collaborative combat aircraft. What could be gleaned from that for the commercial side of things? From an operational standpoint, that might be really interesting. Will there be new airframes developed to meet the challenges of Pacific range? And I'm thinking here in particular, maybe it's more than the B-21. Maybe blended wing body becomes a great way of reconciling low observability and range. And that in turn impacts the next generation of civil aircraft, be it business jets or jetliners. So I think there's all sorts of stuff that we could think about happening over the next couple of decades as a consequence of this change.
Richard, talk a little bit about the commercial aviation market, the airline market. Where do you see it? What are you excited about? And how do you see it playing out over the next 5 or 10 years?
I've never seen such a profound bifurcation, just a split between two formerly linked markets and now two extremely different ones. I'm thinking here of single aisles and twin aisles. Right now, they can't build single aisles literally fast enough. And Airbus is hell-bent for weather on rate 75 in 2025 for its single aisles. Boeing has been struggling to get to rate 31. I hope they get there. I think they're just about there. Hopefully they'll move beyond that into the 40s, maybe even the 50s. Twin aisles, I'd rather sell you a radioactive rock or try to rather than try to sell you a live battery. Because nobody wants these things. And it's for all the obvious reasons. It's international air traffic hit most by the pandemic. It's by the overbuilding we saw in the last decade. It's, of course, what's going on in China. And then on top of that, you've got this big secular shift in airline fleet planning away from twins towards singles. Just a couple of years ago, I flew from Heathrow to Halifax in a 737. Anyone who can replace a twin with a single is doing so. This is going to have a big impact. Maybe this is a good answer to your other question there, Luca, about things that people aren't paying attention to. I think this is going to impact new product development in a very big way. And that gets to the second part of this question. What am I looking forward to? Boeing needs to do something because they're really getting clobbered by Airbus's A321neo. And to put an optimistic spin on things, if they start down the path of new product development, they have a great track record of nailing it. The 777 wasn't first, but it was best. The 787 wasn't first to that market segment, but it was best. The 767 wasn't first, but it was best. If they could do that now, they'll get back to number one and maybe even get back to a 60% market share. But if they don't, then in 10 years' time, Airbus will have 2/3 of the market.
What about the commercial airline industry? What are the trends? How do you see that going forward the next 5-10 years?
Well, it's really interesting, right? We just came off of this situation where if we'd had this conversation at the start of the pandemic, I'd say, oh, the living will envy the dead, right? There'll be massive carnage. And there really wasn't. Governments worldwide basically did what it took. I would have thought that the sort of sixth freedom connector carriers in the Arab Gulf countries would have taken a real hit, but they seem to have done okay. Everyone, even Norwegian, which looked terminal, or AirAsia X looked terminal. So it's pretty clear that the past 3 years we've either done nothing in terms of industry rationalization or things have been fine. Take your pick, optimistic or pessimistic, right? Where are we going? I think it's a fair bet to say that the low-cost model will continue to prevail. I think it's a fair bet to say that everyone is moving towards point-to-point and away from hub and spoke. That's been the way for some time. And frankly, from a fuel burn perspective, that's absolutely good too. You're taking off and landing with somebody half as many times, right? I think that's pretty clear. But in terms of that, another big mega trend is that it's hard to make people go away. How to be gentle about this? I remember back the old joke from 20 years ago. How many airlines will there be in the year 2025? And the answer was 3: 2 globally merged mega carriers and financially troubled TWA. It's tough to make people go away. So I think it's a fair bet that barriers to exit will remain kind of in place for the most part.
When you consider how the markets today, aero markets today, are concentrated, at least on a platform basis, how surprising is this? And how do you see that potentially changing?
Yeah, part of that is a function of barriers to entrance, right? For decades now, the Air Force has said, oh, of course, we welcome new entrants. Look at General Atomics. 20 years later, of course, we welcome new entrants. Look at General Atomics. It could be that maybe the emergence of collaborative combat aircraft will allow for new small players, but I'm not so sure. Everyone seems to have barriers to entrance firmly in place. Business aviation, jetliners, of course. Maybe there'll be the sort of, Elon Musk character who comes along and builds a better jetliner, but it sure doesn't look like it. Given that, I guess I'm not terribly surprised. On the defense side, people build what they can and they update their systems with new avionics, new connectivity, new weaponry, whatever else. It makes the business case for a new platform that much harder. And on the jetliner side, that's an interesting one. Back in the days of aggressive new turbine development, when it was very clear, all you had to do was put a new engine on. Hell, the 737 MAX has been in production since 1965, just with new engines each generation. If we're running out of runway on the engine front, then we need new airframes. That, I think, is the answer to your question. That could change. If we run out of runway with turbines, then we must get new airframes to meet the demands of an ESG-focused marketplace.
So, Richard, how do you see ESG affecting, let's stay with commercial aviation. You talked about the hybrid electric, you talked about SAF, hydrogen. How will that play out in the next 10 years? And is it for real? Is this something they need to pay attention to? And how will they address the needs of ESG?
Yeah, great question. I think they need to take it seriously. Is it serious? Will it show up in the form of mandates and airport limits, capacity limits, and carbon taxes and whatever? Good risk of it, good chance of it. Are young people changing their attitudes? They just might be. We don't know, but you got to take it seriously. The only thing we have that's clear, and it's not all that clear, is SAF. Everything else, we just got to see. There are a lot of skeptics in hydrogen. There's a lot of hope for hybrid electric in the smaller part, of the flight envelope there. The one thing that everyone agrees on, though, and maybe the most important answer to your question, is that it's going to cost more and therefore it's going to impact growth rates. We used to argue, what is the long-term demand for air transport? Is it going to be 4.9%? Is it going to be 5.1%? Is it going to be 5.05? This was, believe it or not, arguments we used to have 30 years ago. After many years of 4.8 or whatever, 4.9, 5, this year, Airbus and Boeing both came out. One was 3.6 and the other was 3.8. What does that tell you, right? I mean, it's going to cost more and it's going to have an impact on demand growth moving forward.
Yeah. Are people prepared to pay a lot more for their ticket in order to be able to have a cleaner environment for their aircraft? And as you've talked about, what you've basically said on the advanced air mobility front, it's not an ESG play. Talk about that a little bit. About, at the end of the day, it's all about SAF. The longer range and the larger aircraft, it's really only SAF is the opportunity to reduce the impact on the environment.
Yeah, Jim, that's a really interesting one. My feeling perhaps is a bit more cynical there. The answer is this won't come from consumer behavior. I just don't think it's that broad-based. I don't think there are enough people willing to check that box saying, I want to pay $20 to offset carbon. And I'm not saying this as if I'm cynical about environmentalism. I'm not, far from it. And my kids are pretty strong on the matter. But most people still, it all comes down to rational self-interest, and they just aren't paying more. So if government mandates higher fees in order to put a drag on demand or to pay for some kind of de facto offset, which I think is a reasonable assumption, will people pay that higher ticket price? I would argue, yeah, we've looked at elasticity in this business and it's not so clear cut. People have been able to stimulate demand for air travel with lower prices, but then when it goes up again, it isn't that sensitive. It's a little bit paradoxical. So I think we could probably see an increase in fares as a consequence of this ESG thinking and not have to worry too much up to a certain point. Beyond that, we'll see, right?
Are you surprised, Richard, by how the sustainability discussion in aviation matured over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I sure am. As a matter of fact, I remember being pretty cynical about it. It was the summer of Greta Thunberg, right? I think it was 2019, if memory serves, and KLM had that legendary ad on their website or comment on their website. Do you really need to travel? And then at the same time, Air France was arguing against a 1 or 2 euro carbon tax increase in the French government. They were lobbying against it. And I had explained to people, this is the same corporation. It's Air France KLM. There's, one is marketing to a Dutch audience, the other is marketing to a French audience. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch that, because it sure happened all of a sudden that more and more people began to think a bit more like that. And it could be the experience of the pandemic, and everyone said, hey, look, there are dolphins in Venice again, and whatever else. Or it could be young people getting a little older and bringing their environmental sensibilities into bear. Or it could just be government. I don't know, but it does seem to be changing. Absolutely.
Yeah. It could be also some of the relief funding in Europe being tied to some environmental friendly and sustainability outcomes.
Sure.
We think about this question a lot. And on the one hand, you have huge investments in new technology, which comes with a lot of uncertainty about just not really having the evidence of safety in some of these new propulsion systems. And it comes with additional training, both for air crew and folks on the ground, then massive infrastructure investments at airports and broadly. And on the other hand, of the other end of the spectrum, you have solutions that really are very much plug and play and not rip and replace. When you look at where the investment dollars are going in the industry, it really does make you wonder.
You're exactly right, Luca. So much of that French 1.5 billion fund went into hydrogen, which so far to me is the one that makes the least sense. And the plug and play aspect, of course, SAF and whatever else, just makes so much more sense. But one problem there, of course, is that technology comes from somewhere else outside of our industry. But you got it exactly right. The market was a little bit distorted by that input of technology development funding.
Right.
And Richard,
Right.
when you look at the field of SAF developments, are they all on the same playing field, or are there some that are very different approaches that would have a different reception or strategic impact in the industry?
Yeah, great question, Peter. I mean, there are some really interesting approaches. There's so many different interesting experiments. I am glad to see that some of the crazy upfront stuff from a few years ago, Virgin Atlantic's tree nut oil flight, the legendary Richard Branson thing. It's like, we saved an oil well, but we chopped down a rainforest. Yeah, that makes sense. It's good to see that going away. People are paying more attention to feedstocks and what the impact is of creating those feedstocks. E-fuels, I think, are looked upon as a fascinating area. People have even said that maybe nuclear power with e-fuels, that might be the most, bizarrely enough, ecologically friendly way forward here, or just harnessing hydropower for e-fuels and whatever else. And then, of course, there are various forms of algae and whatever else in the feedstock world, waste oil, whatever. The one thing that everyone agrees on is it all comes down to scaling, right? You can do some interesting stuff, but if you can't scale it up at a reasonable price without taking the entire surface area of Brazil to create your feedstock, you shouldn't do it.
Well, if you look at e-fuels as an example, and recognizing that there's a lot of technology development that probably has to go on in that field, but if those milestones were achieved and e-fuels gave the industry a way to invest in fuel production absent dependency on, a volatilely priced commodity feedstock, what might that mean for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be good. But on the other hand, we've had to cope with an environment of high fuel costs and a great deal of fuel volatility for some time. So would there be financial mechanisms that would allow for hedging? Would there be public-private partnerships that could smooth out the cost somewhat or make it less risky? I would hope there'd be ways to mitigate the impact of that rather big question, right?
Richard, you are talking to a large audience right now of entrepreneurs who are who are interested in forming and growing companies at the intersection of tech and flight. So before we ask you the question of which technologies do you think are most interesting for them to focus on, what tech investments have had the greatest impact in aviation? I don't care if it's commercial or military. And what have had the greatest investment returns? And then part two, which ones do you think are going to be the most interesting going forward?
Well, yeah, when you broaden it to civil and military there, Jim, it becomes, it's such a broad universe, but obviously connectivity is a universal good, right? Whether it's for safety reasons, operational reasons, maintenance reasons, reducing inventory and maintenance events and whatever else, or frankly, allowing interactivity between offboard sensors, onboard sensors, combat aircraft, and whatever else. Connectivity. Oh boy, anything that allows for. I saw yesterday L3Harris purchased, the tactical data link division of Viasat. That's exactly the kind of company that's going to be more relevant moving forward because of the need for these interactive, this interactivity between combat platforms. That is all very interesting to me, how things are getting hyper fast and eliminating distance and eliminating latency in transmissions. On the combat side, low observability has no doubt had a profound impact. Anything to do with turbines has paid its weight. When it comes down to investments in the sort of materials and architectures that have driven fuel burn improvements and thrust to weight ratios and turbine engines, I don't have any doubt that it's been a brilliant investment. I just have my doubts about how much more runway we have to go there, to keep going down that path. We might have reached where we might be getting near the limits. I think there's all kinds of improvements moving forward, but it's just not the kind of guaranteed performance improvements and economics improvements that we've enjoyed over the first half century or the first 70 years of jetliner flight.
Richard, you've mentioned collaborative combat aircraft a couple times already, so I think it might be worth lingering on this topic for a little bit, if you don't mind. What are the timelines realistic timelines, in your opinion, to get collaborative combat aircraft, both with adequate autonomous capabilities and low cost enough to make the proposition work?
Yeah, and that's one of those places where the industry and, of course, the military services are kind of heavily dependent upon people who have nothing, who are not in our industry, right? I mean, a lot of it comes down to AI, and with the right AI, you can start to get the kind of swarms needed to cope with the quantitative challenges of Pacific operations. You can have one crewed combat aircraft controlling 10, 20, 30, God knows, drones, and just completely changing the game. Unfortunately, most people in the field tell me that AI like that is decades away. So what we're coming down to is large, loyal wingmen, maybe a 1 or 2 to 1 ratio, which I'm sure helps. It's an awful lot that has to be learned. It's not a game changer, but it's nice. And you'll probably start to see those appear in the 2030s. It's interesting to see what Australia is doing with Ghost Bat and Boeing. Obviously, US Skyborg Oil Wingman, the UK RAF had Mosquito. I guess it's going to be started up again in another form. But I'd be surprised if some kind of capability didn't emerge in the second half of the 2030s. But really, it's going to be another 10 or 20 years beyond that before we have the AI-driven swarms that really change combat operations drastically.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree for the larger scale UAS systems, the ones that might, say, fly alongside the B-21. But on the lower end of the spectrum, I think we will definitely see a big uptick in some of the smaller UAS systems being deployed in innovative combat formations, certainly in this decade.
Yeah, in maybe this decade in small numbers, but I think in broader deployment, it's really a 2030s story. I mean, but on the other hand, production will be higher than deployment because positioning is a major challenge, right? It's not like you can carry them under the wing right now. So they have to be there when you need them, stationed in Guam or Frankfurt or whatever. And that means, of course, producing a lot more than are actually deployable.
Did I hear you right that you think that the autonomy piece is a bigger challenge than getting the low cost of these airframes?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we can build cruise missiles that loiter. I mean, they're not that expensive, right? I mean, putting all the systems on board, obviously that's going to make them, I mean, let's do some crude numbers. If you want to build a Valkyrie class or a Ghost Bat class, recurring today is, I don't know, what, 10, 15 million, I'm willing to guess, maybe 20, depending upon what you want on board. To get the kind of swarms we want, would it be that hugely challenging to build controllable $1 million air vehicles? I don't know. It seems within the realm of doable. I mean, I have friends who were active. Actually, my co-managing director, Kevin Michaels at AeroDynamic, had a role to play at Williams International on the cruise missile engines of the 80s, and think about all they achieved. So scaling air vehicles down and making them cost effective, as the Alcoms, Glickums, and Slickums of the time certainly were, I don't think it's as big a challenge as AI. That's going to be a major hurdle.
Yeah. See, I'm actually of a different opinion, and I think that in the defense domain, at least, so make that caveat, there is already really sophisticated technology stack that allows really impressive autonomous behaviors in some of these combat systems. And when deployed in military environments in the Pacific, as you mentioned, the risk-reward equation is so much different that it actually becomes fieldable and deployable. But on the other side, I have a concern about making those aircraft low cost enough to make them attritable. So let's take the B-21 Wingman, for example, which recently has been scrapped, at least in the near term, because realistically, if you expect that there will be an unmanned system that can fly 6,000 miles, carry 40,000 pounds of payload, give or take, and also fly at high subsonic speeds, well, then you have yourself another B-21 and not really a loyal wingman to it. So I think the challenge there is not so much that you can actually fly and command and control a UAS the way that you want, but really making it work on a numbers basis and on a cost basis.
Well, you might well be right. I mean, obviously, it depends on how you're going to deploy it and whether it's going to come with you for the long haul. Obviously, the B-21 is going to be a 4,000 nautical mile vehicle. Building something to accompany it is inherently expensive. But if you're looking at something that you pre-position, station, and launch as needed, obviously, the range and size requirements becomes a lot less. So
Sure.
it really depends. But you got a point. You got to make these things cost effective, pure and simple. Otherwise, yeah, you're right. You're just replicating a smaller wheel, as it were.
Richard, do you see the way that the services are exploring the use of this technology for logistics in the combat theater? Do you see that evolving on a different path, whether we're talking about 100-pound payloads in relatively small air vehicles or much larger vehicles? How do you see that exploration and that learning curve unfolding?
For logistical purposes, I'm a little uncertain because, even though there's an awful lot that can be done with remotely controlled systems for logistical purposes, you do have the problem with range in the Pacific. So what might be relevant and easy in Central Asia or Europe, it's really just fiendishly challenging in the Pacific. You look at some of the systems that they're looking at, Agility Prime and whatever. I can see them being relevant in certain operating environments, but in the Pacific, that might be a very different story. So I think in my view, Peter, it just comes down to where you're planning on using them.
Let's talk a little bit about advanced air mobility. What drove the interest? Was it a use case that needed to be addressed, or was it technology needing to find a home?
To be cynical, Jim, it looked like it was a massive surplus of investment cash that needed to find a home, but it was also definitely technology. One of the most important words of advice, for what it's worth, I would give anybody is remember there are two types of people in the industry, very broadly speaking, engineers and economists, and they don't like talking to each other very much. And it's important to have that conversation.
Well, it's also interesting. I'm going to throw out, there's also kind of the Silicon Valley meets aerospace. One of our guests, Luca, talked about, within their own company, there was this conflict between those who said anything is possible and then those who say, remember, this is the aviation business and things have to be done in a certain way.
That's dead on. As a matter of fact, it's very timely. I guess it was last week that Larry Page's big investment, Kitty Hawk, just sort of said, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. The Silicon Valley mentality, respect that California optimism, gotta love it, but it worked in software because that was all greenfield. It worked for a couple of things, and then it very often didn't work. Anybody have any shares in pets.com they'd like to sell? There are limits. And what eventually evolved in Silicon Valley was this bizarre VC model where you put these $10 or $20 million bets on 100 things or 1,000 things. One or two of them are unicorns. You make a pile of money. The others are dogs. And it's been that way for some time. But basically, that's what's happened. They basically said, hey, we can cater to this crowd. We'll get 20 VC funds to give us $10 million each. We're golden or whatever, and worry about the consequences later.
So when you think about the drones, electric aircraft, VTOL and the like, there's got to be parts of it that you find intriguing and that you think may change the industry a bit. What are you most intrigued with?
Well, they become great testing grounds for autonomy. And there are a lot of people who think, probably rightly, that's why Boeing likes Whisk, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in terms of electric architectures, I'll bet we're going to learn an awful lot from these. And, frankly, the idea of scaling down vertical flight into a smaller vehicle that allows for packages or organ transfers or whatever, that's great. I think my one only really big area of disagreement is that this is going to become some kind of urban airborne mass transit system. I just really don't see it.
One of our guests really caught me with something it took me back a bit. I'm not going to mention who it was, but he mentioned that there's the possibility that these vehicles will connect me from, a couple of miles from my home to the world. And so rather than, I'm on the water in Connecticut, 2.5 hours from JFK, 2 hours from LaGuardia, but it takes a long time for me to get to an airport. It's a pain in the neck to be able to be so easily connected, a couple of miles from my home to the world. And to think about the convenience that would come from that. What are your thoughts on that? Am I overplaying the potential, or am I just an outlier based on where I'm at?
You want the good news or the bad news? I mean, the good news is they might be able to get you a lobster roll from Abbott's pretty quickly and effectively. And we all want to live in that world, right? The fundamental problem is that these things are expensive. And I don't know about you, Jim, but I don't often get exclusive access to systems that cost $4 million. And the ability of, say, someone in the Hamptons to get a helicopter to JFK has never been in doubt. You can do that. But those helicopters cost $4 million, and therefore your ticket costs a lot. And people are cost effective. So, look, do you want to get to Providence or Hartford or wherever you want, and you're willing to pay a few $100 to do that, or 500 or whatever? God bless you. You should. Most people aren't. My fundamental point is that these systems don't change that game, that the rules of that.
So the value is there. If you can get the cost of operation down, as some of our guests they feel that's the mission of their companies. If you can get the cost down, there's a need, but you're skeptical as to whether you can get the cost down enough to be able to create the demand in the market.
Yeah, for two reasons. One, you look at the air vehicles, they look expensive. Some look ludicrously expensive, like Lilium. It's like, what? It looks B-21 bomber expensive. But, even in the Archer SPAC filing, it comes out and says these are $5 million air vehicles. We can get the cost down, but they're still multi-million-dollar air vehicles. The other thing, of course, is the educated and trained professional who's driving you. And maybe within our lifetimes, if we're super lucky, that will become a supervisory job like an elevator operator in the old days. But for the next couple decades, I'm willing to bet it's that educated and well-trained professional who earns whatever a rotorcraft pilot earns. So that capital cost and the pilot cost, that makes this look an awful lot like a helicopter in terms of economics.
So as I listen to you elaborate on this, Richard, I think you're actually a fan of advanced air mobility. and I will say this because I think we all recognize that we are now in a place where we have gotten these new tools into our hands, and we're exploring with new technologies. To your point, we're learning about integrating autonomy and how to best use it. We're getting exposure and learnings on electric architectures, ability to develop systems that address use cases that have been far, far beyond our sphere of what's possible, just a couple of decades ago. But naturally, as is normal in any industry, it will take smart teams to put all of those pieces together into something that the market is willing to ingest and digest at cost levels that make the business case work. And that's just a normal path of evolution.
Well, I think that's valid. My big concern is the number of companies being stood up. There are some interesting technologies to explore, as you say. Does that merit funding or overfunding 200 or 300 unique companies? I have my doubts.
Yeah. And, we talked about this on this podcast before, but it's very similar to the early days of the automotive industry, where there was, I think, somewhere between 300 and 500 new entrants at the turn of the 20th century that innovated in these new technologies around the car. There were some striking similarities. First of all, they couldn't agree on what to call these new vehicles. Second of all, they were exploring with just a very wide range of designs. Some were even resembling horses. So they built this vehicle in the shape of a horse so that it doesn't spook other people or other horses that were riding on the street when they saw a horseless carriage. And then also the supply chain and all the technology that supported it has been very, very vertically integrated. So people have been developing their own brakes and carburetors and steering wheels, et cetera, et cetera. And then slowly we have, the industry has converged on designs that later became adopted as the standard, as common. And then we have cracked the affordability side of that equation with the Model T, and there you go. Not too long after that, we have a massive industry.
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, you've got my reservations on this. One is the use of an aerospace grade supply chain, which makes everything much more expensive than automotive, is going to hobble us for decades to come. And I don't mean hobble, it's what makes things safe, but it also hobbles us economically. It keeps
Absolutely.
that automotive outcome from happening anytime.
No. I mean, I have to clarify. I wasn't making the case that we can just copy and paste
Right.
What we're seeing in the auto industry into aviation. Those are two separate worlds, but at least the general direction of the industry in the early days and how you go from a very vertically integrated, many players kind of mode into a richer ecosystem supporting it, richer supply base supporting fewer players. That's just a natural progression, but certainly more expensive and longer than in the auto industry for the reasons you mentioned.
Right.
Hey, Richard, you have a really popular newsletter that we all enjoy. What do you write about that is going to get a lot of attention? And then what's been your most popular newsletter and why?
Well, thanks for asking. I wish I did a better job of keeping track of the metrics associated with my lettering. I wish I could tell you. I put them on LinkedIn, and I do track the number of hits there. I don't know how many other people just randomly go to my website routinely, or just I think I've got a few hundred people on my listserv that get it that way. But gosh, one guaranteed attention getter is looking quite frankly at what Boeing needs to do, because there are so many stakeholders in the American industry and the world industry that depend on them making a comeback. And they've spent, how to put this gently, a bunch of years now not doing the right thing. That anything that I say that I think encourages them to do the right thing gets attention. And my objective recently is to no longer criticize. It's to say, here's what you should do. Please do it. And I think what they could do would be incredible. And it would be to the benefit of the entire industry. I just hope they do it.
Give our audience, what are the top 3 things you'd recommend if you were the CEO of Boeing?
The obvious one, of course, is to get going on a new jet for the first time in 18, 19 years, a clean sheet design. Second, go after that mid-market, because I think that route fragmentation effect that we're seeing in the airline industry and fleet planning, it's got legs. It's got decades ahead. And if you can stimulate that by building the perfect 5,000 nautical mile, 240 seat single aisle design, you win. And they have a history of getting it right. So aside from that, the two, I would argue, bigger things: change the culture to focus on engineering and technology again, rather than financial returns. And very simply, it's been a long time since they've said that. And the second thing is, get away from leverage. This is the sort of toxic confluence of that emphasis on financial mechanics at the expense of, actual mechanics. It's when you say, we can do more with less. Return on net assets was their big thing. And that's what led them, for example, with the 787 to rely on other people's engineering, or with their disastrous bomber bid for the U.S. Air Force. They said, we're going to build the nation's next bomber. It'll be designed by Lockheed Martin. Are you kidding me? There's been so much of an emphasis on other people doing the heavy lifting on engineering and design. And I think they've lost sight of the fact that what made them great was, exactly that: technology and coming up with a product that the market really wanted. So I'd have them get back to their roots, pure and simple, and focus on that, and start appointing people to the board and to the executive leadership team who are focused on technology, program management, and all the things that used to really matter to them.
Somebody calls you and says, I want to invest $1 billion and I'm willing to wait 5, 10, 20 years for my return, targeted towards technology and aviation. Where would you tell them to go?
Well, the biggest market by far, of course, is jetliners. What form does that take? I'd ask everybody to remember that, 99% of technology development should fall under either two buckets, something that enhances revenue, which is really hard, or something that lower cost, raise RASM or lower CASM.
Mhm.
Lowering CASM is somewhat easier. So I look at the array of propulsion possibilities out there, and I'd say, hey, I've got $1 billion. Holy cow. I could really help someone's business case. Is that a prop fan? Is that getting Rolls-Royce going faster on UltraFan or restarting UltraFan? Because the Air Current this summer reported that they were perhaps shelving it. I look at the array of propulsion options. Is it bringing a turboprop to market? Because we've kind of neglected that space, and in a time of ESG and fuel concerns, maybe that has relevance. I don't know the answer. I would focus on the CASM reduction, and I would say, if I've got $1 billion, I could be a partner in making something happen. So that's what I'd approach it.
Propulsion is where you would point to.
Yeah, and maybe it's materials, maybe it's diagnostics for maintenance. I don't know. Maybe it's some adjunct capability. I mean, I remember a few years ago, people were getting into power washing of all things, but saying, "Hey, this saves 2 or 3%." I mean, there's all these things that I think can impact the economics of commercial aircraft, starting with propulsion, and also have great knock-on effects with ESG concerns and whatever else. I guess I would look there.
You've mentioned that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos disrupted space. Why can't they disrupt commercial aviation? What did you mean by that? And what would potentially disruptions in commercial aviation look like?
One problem is that disrupting space was easy because it was a monopoly player using government money. That's not commercial. Commercial is actually pretty lean. It's pretty good. I am intrigued at the idea, it kind of gets me back to President Lincoln with that Civil War general. If you're not going to use your army, can we borrow it and give it to somebody who will?
Right.
Is it a private equity player who says, we'd like to buy Boeing commercial aircraft now, please? We're going to start creating new products and changing the culture. That would be great. But short of that, can you really disrupt it? I don't know. I mean, frankly, my favorite form of disruption is to take a mezzanine contractor like a Raytheon or a General Electric and work with a smaller airframer, maybe one that speaks Brazilian Portuguese, for example, and say, we want to scale you up with our content on board and create a third player. That would be really intriguing.
Richard, when you think about the overall aero value chain, where you have suppliers and OEMs and MROs and airlines, different other operators, lessors even, how are profits distributed within the value chain? And as we introduce new technologies, how do you think that this changes?
Yeah, that's a fascinating one. You look back at the past couple of decades, boy, the finance crowd, they did great, right? And that's what made them sort of the unsung heroes of the pandemic-related downturn. They were able to give people lease holidays and deferrals and whatever else, and keep financing transactions just because they had the cash. That was wonderful. Will they go back to being the big earners here? Good chance of it. There's the endless tug of war over intellectual property and therefore aftermarket revenue between primes and suppliers. That tug of war will likely continue. It's hard to see anyone winning that war, even though the war will keep going. Airlines, they've consistently gotten a bit more profitable, but subject to devastating pandemic-like events. If you've got the appetite for massive disruption, or I should say, just a massive exogenous shock, then airlines do okay these days, except for those massive exogenous shocks. So it's a broad pattern. You understand, looking at the commercial world and looking at the defense world, why more and more suppliers are saying, yeah, we're putting our chips on the defense side. Almost no risk, non-recurring paid for, and cost plus production contracts. Oh, this is a no-brainer. It's hard in the commercial world. And again, aside from the lease and finance crowd, it's hard to see a clear winner.
Interesting. You mentioned earlier in the conversation barriers to exit. And that's not something that we hear very often. So do you mind elaborating?
Yeah, I mean, it was brutally true. I mean, part of it was Chapter 11 bankruptcy regs that were ridiculously lenient, allowing, zombie airlines to stalk the landscape with zombie pricing, but that changed. There was a bit of sometime in the mid-2000s, there was a change to Chapter 11 bankruptcy regs that allowed people to go away, but that impacted a few people. And every so often you'll see like the the recent Spirit JetBlue thing, there'll be something like that. But how long has it been since we've made something significant happen in the airline business? Maybe we shouldn't, but on the other hand, you've you've got an awful lot of marginal legacy carriers all over the place that are still doing business if they're owned by somebody else. It's just very hard to achieve the level of rationalization you'd think should exist. There are 5 helicopter players, 5 business jet players. That's probably one more than you need in either one, but you're not going to change that anytime soon.
Who would you put on the board of a company? Who do you think the most of?
Well, obviously, there are great people up and down the supply chain and all the way at the top. Most of them are getting a little up there and maybe just very happy to be in retirement. Alan Mulally comes to mind. I believe he's 76. He's still he achieved incredible things. There are some younger folks, on the supplier level, people like Dave Hess or someone, we've got Dave Gitlin, he's CEO of Carrier. There are really good people out there still who are maybe not directly in aerospace or are now on boards or whatever. Then you've got people who maybe left a little bit early. I'm thinking here of Wes Bush from Northrop Grumman, or just maybe David Joyce from GE. There's certainly great people out there who I think could be. The big question is, who does Boeing perhaps need to add to their board? And I would urge them to look at people with that confluence of technical skills and program management experience. That's really what it comes down to.
5-10 years, what does the industry look like? Military, civilian?
I think the defense side is fantastic and has achieved great things and helped secure the future of the Western world. I believe the allied democratic powers, both in Asia, Europe, and the US, can work together to keep the bad people at bay. And I'm a big believer in the industry as being a key part of that in terms of technology development and securing the future. In terms of the commercial side, I think we can meet the challenge. I think we'll be considerably bigger. We won't have had the same growth rates. In my ideal world, China will have come back to the fold and be an addressable market for everybody. Can't guarantee that. But the important thing is that even if we do have to come back to a 1980s future where the Western liberal democracies all work together in terms of open markets, in terms of free societies, and in terms of defense, then we'll have a much bigger, wealthier, happier world. And hopefully one day China and Russia will join us in that.
Richard, what advice would you give to someone who wants to start a business in aviation or advanced air mobility?
Be as ecumenical as possible. If you're developing a new technology, make it addressable for multiple platforms and applications and market segments, because obviously there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of new technology drivers for platforms and in terms of the overall health of individual market segments. So you look at things like diagnostics, you look at things like connectivity. They have a kind of universal appeal. So go for that ecumenical approach, I guess, is my emphasis.
Richard, with our audience of entrepreneurs, what would be one closing statement you'd like to make them to wrap up this podcast? What message would you want to send to them?
Well, thank you, I guess I'd want to say, because this industry is built with the hard work of inventors and people who make the industry safer, more effective, more profitable, and just a great place to work.
And as you prepared for the podcast, you were thinking you wanted to leave a one message that would wrap up this last hour plus. What would it be?
We're recovering from one of the worst downturns we've seen, but we're going to get back there. We're making great progress. We're going to recover from the production disruptions, and we'll be stronger and better than we ever were before as an industry.
Luca, Peter, any other questions from you?
No questions. Richard, thank you very much for being our guest and for being so generous with your time and your thoughts. Really, really appreciate the conversation.
Guys, I can't thank you enough for having me on. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.